Hi class, in this video we're going to go over chapter 18, the market for factory productions. So this is somewhat not so hard chapter compared to the previous ones. So I would say this is much easier than oligopoly and also monopolist competition. So many informations here is based on what we learned before in chapter 4. So the basic information on supply demand. But the only difference is for the longest time we'll be looking at the market from the good and service market, where the companies are the seller or the supply side, and then the household are the demand side. But in this chapter here, the market for factory productions, we're going to see the two roles switched. That we're going to see the firms become the demand side for the factory production market, and then we're going to see household, especially laborers, so us become the supply side for this market for factory productions. Okay, all right, so let's cover some basic definitions. So a little review from what you know before. So know what's a factory production. So this is the input company used to produce goods and services. And then again, there's three categories for factory productions. They're called land, labor, and capital. So labor are the employees company will hire. Land are more than the land you're standing on. Land here is also covering all the natural resources come from land. So your electricity, your water, your sunlight, so all those natural resources are part of land. And then capital here is a little special. So this capital is only your physical capital. So machines, tools, the company can accumulate from previous productions to use for future productions. Computers, trucks. But any type of a financial capital, so like a stocks or bond or money, they are not part of our factory production, because the financial capital is only an intermediary between what the company need and what the company can purchase. So that's why company don't need money. Company need what money can purchase, which is the physical capitals company can purchase. Okay, so land, labor, and capital are the three factory productions. So we're going to look at, in this chapter we're looking at mainly labor, but we're going to touch on land and capital in the last little section of this chapter. And then next, know the demand. So know something called a derived demand. So derived demand is like a indirect demand. That's something that we don't need directly, but because you demand for this good and service, and this good and service demand these resources, then we kind of indirectly demand these resources. So for example, we all need to buy bread, right? So because we need bread, and then bakery need to hire bakers, so therefore we also indirectly need those bakers. So that's why that's called a derived demand or indirect demand. So many of the factory productions here, they have this indirect demand or derived demand from this good and service market. All right, so next, let's look at labor. So labor market. So labor market is just like any other market. Labor is also resource, is any type of good and service. So labor is also governed by our supply demand. But be very careful, because now the two roles are switched. So the supply side for labor, this is our household. And the demand side for labor, these are the companies, the firms. Because who need to hire the laborers are the company who need to hire laborers, and then who supply the laborers are the household, the individual household. So you and me, all the families in the country, then we're the supply side for the labor market. So labor demand is also type of derived demand, that just like I mentioned before, for service of a baker, right? Or maybe for service of a Uber driver, right? So we need a Uber service, right? And then to supply to perform Uber service, we need an Uber driver. So that's why we indirectly demand this Uber driver, right? So that's called derived demand. All right, so labor service equal to the input into the production of other goods. So everything we produce will all be requiring these labor services. Well, actually, most of the goods produced now, because there are some companies who need very minimum labor services. So for example, there's a restaurant called Spice Chicken, SPICE. Oh no, SPYCE. So it's based in New York and Boston. So it's a fully robotic kitchen. So you go into the it's fully robotic restaurant. So you go into the restaurant, you order from the computer screen, and then it will be the robotics that cook the meal for you, right? So in those you require very minimum labor, but for most the stuff we produce, they all require labor services. All right, so let's look at this Apple market. So for the Apple market, we have our demand for Apple. So demand supply for Apple. This is what we looked at it before. So the price for Apple is determined by the demand supply for Apple. Now, the market for apple pickers, so the laborers who actually go into the field to pick those apples, their demand also depends on the price of apple, right? So the market for apple pickers is also determined by the supply demand, but it's different type of supply demand. So this supply are the household, and then this demand here are the firms. So companies or farms who need to hire those workers. And for the Apple market here, the supply here is the firms, the farmers, and demand is the household. So that's why I say that these two rows here, they are switched whenever we talk about the market for goods and service, which is the market for apples, and then the market for factory productions, which is the market for the apple pickers. All right, so a couple of assumptions. So first, we're gonna assume that firms are all in a very competitive situation in both market. So firms are in a competitive situation in both the good and service market and also the market for factory productions. And I'm going to assume that the firms, because they're in a competitive situation, they're all price taker, so they can only take what the price already set in both market, right? So they will take what the price is already set in the price of Apple, and then they will also take the prices that's already set in the wage for the employees. So because the company are so small, they don't have any influences over the price of Apple or the price of or the wage of Apple picker. So imagine that if you're farmer in your county, and then there are also many other farmers in the same county, and you decide to pay your worker less, so you pay a lower wage, and then what happens? That those workers will go to work for somebody else, and you have nobody left, and then you are forced to increase your wage to the same level as everybody else, right? So that's called a price taker. Now, that situation only exists whenever the firms are very small, like we studied before in the monopoly market. So if your company is so big that there's no other choices, so imagine that if you're the only apple farm in town, and all those apple pickers has no other options but to work for you, then you can decide what the wage is, right? But in those situations that when there's only one buyer for the service, now monopoly is for one seller, one buyer is called monopsony. Okay, so one buyer is called monopoly, one seller, no, sorry, one seller is a monopoly, one buyer is a monopsony. All right, and then again, the last thing to consider to also always make sure that the companies always try to maximize the profit. Therefore, they will try to produce as much good as possible there in order to maximize the profit. All right, so also known the production function. So again, we touched on this in the previous chapters. So production function, this exists between your quantity of good produced and then the input we're going to put into it, or the resource you need to put into it for producing this good. So you have your output equals to a function of input. So all this input, there are the resources. And imagine let's suppose for apple farmer, the only resource we need are the labor. Then how much apple you produce equals to a function of how many workers you hire, right? So the more worker you hire, the more production you have. But also remember that this rate of increase, or the marginal product, is decreasing as the more and more produce. So again, this is mentioned, or you should have learned this in chapter 13, that the marginal product of labor is increasing, but it's increasing at a slower rate, right? So eventually, if you look at how much you're producing, it will be becoming less and less. So couple more definitions. So know what's a marginal product of labor. So marginal product of labor is the additional production from each additional labor. So if you hire one more worker, how many more production do you have? That's called a marginal product of labor. So let's suppose you have one person, you produce 10 apples, you hire two people, you produce 15 apples, then the MPL, the marginal product of labor, is the difference between the different levels here. So it'd be just so the second worker would just be 5. So by hiring one more worker, I produce 5 more apples. That's called a marginal product of labor. And I also know the diminishing marginal product. So so this is a theory, which is almost true, that for many companies, if you keep hiring more worker, the efficiency of each additional worker become less and less and less, and then eventually that you might not have any extra production for additional workers. You might have a lower production for each additional workers. So the quantity of input increases, but the output is increasing at a slower rate. Okay, so the marginal product of an input declines as the quantity of input increases. So what that means, let me show you the next slide. It's on the table. All right, so we have our, let's look at this 2 column here. So labor and then your output. So by hire 0 worker, I have nothing, which is true, right? Nobody's working. Of course, you produce nothing. But by having 1 worker, I have 100 unit of production. So the marginal product of labor is 100 unit. Okay, so the difference between 0 and 100. Now next level, I hired 2 people. I produce total 180. So the extra unit is 80. And then next one, I hired 3 people. The extra unit is 60. And then next one, the extra is 40, and the extra is 20. So you see how this MPL here on the 3rd column is decreasing. So as the more people are hired, the lower the marginal production is. That's called the diminishing marginal product. And there is, again, the reason why that is because think about a kitchen, right? So let's suppose I have a business. I produce chicken fried rice, right? So I produce chicken fried rice and nothing else. And let's suppose I just keep hiring more people in my kitchen. Now, in the beginning, I hire more people, I can produce more good. But imagine the space is very limited and I just keep hiring more people into my kitchen. And eventually the kitchen become overcrowded. And then eventually nobody can move anymore, right? So imagine you bump into each other. Of course you lose efficiency, right? That's why your additional production from each worker is decreasing as the more worker you hire. And then next one, well, let's come back to this, okay? So your production function, you have your quantity of apples, so this is the output. You have your quantity of apple picker, this is the input. So your production function is increasing, but it's increasing at a slower rate, right? So if you guys if you guys study calculus, so this would be a positive first derivative, but it's a negative second derivative. Oh my god, did I just give some people nightmares? Okay, yeah, so okay, unless you're going into upper level economics, you don't have to know that, but just know that the rate of increasing is a slower, right? So a lower marginal product as the more people are hired, right? So the difference is 180 and then 60, 40, and 20, so it's slower rate. So a lower, actually decreasing, a negative second derivative. All right, so next definition, know something called a value of marginal product of labor, or VMPL. So VMPL is how much value can the extra labor bring into the company. So if I hire one more person, how much extra revenue can this person generate? That's called the value of marginal product of labor. So it's actually very simple. All you gotta do is just take your, so VMPL just equal to MPL, the marginal product of labor, times the price of the good you sell, right? So in our Apple business, so go back here, the VMPL here, it's just price times MPL. So for my first worker, I can produce 100 bushels of wood. Do you call apples bushels? 100 bushels of apple? Oh, I'm not a farmer, so let's suppose we do. So the first worker can produce additional 100 bushels of apple, and then each apple is $10, so each bushel $10. then your value MPL is just $1,000. And then next one times 10 is 800, times 10 600, times 10 400, and times 10 200. So just take your MPL times the price. That will give you the VMPL. Okay. So before we go on to the next section, let me ask you guys a question to think about it. How many workers here should I hire, right? Should I hire everybody, or should I hire maybe the first person or second person? So it looks like that everybody is able to generate a revenue for the company, right? So if the wage is nothing, so if I don't pay them anything, then I should hire everybody, right? Because even if the last person here, and the last person, if I don't pay this person anything, so the wage is nothing, and he can generate $200 for the company, then of course I should hire the last person. But wage is not free. Wage is not zero. Well, unless you're working for a family business, and then your parents decide to pay you with love but not money, and we all know love is worthless. Sorry. So in those cases, you're gonna have a zero wage. But in regular business, in regular scenarios, you gotta pay a person a wage. So let's suppose the person's wage is $500. So for each worker we hire, we're gonna pay them $500. And let's say we should hire each individual person. Right. So for the first person, we're gonna pay him $500, and then he can generate $1,000. Should we hire him? Well, sure we should, right? Because he can make more money for the company than what we pay the person. Then the marginal profit for the first person is $500. So we hire the first person. Second person, should we hire him? Of course, because he can generate a profit margin for us. Third person, we'll hire him too. Now, for the fourth person, it's not good anymore, right? Because for the fourth person, we're gonna pay him $500, but he will only give us $400 in return. So we actually lose money on the fourth person. So we're not gonna hire the next two people, because those next two people, their VMPL, the additional value to the company, is not enough to pay for the wages we're gonna pay them. So this company will only hire 3 people. All right, so which brings us a very important concept. The company will hire people as long as your VMPL is more than the wage. Now, they're going to stop hiring people whenever the VMPL is equal to the wage. So we can also put this little equation here into a graphing format, right? Into a graph. So if you look at the VMPL is going down. And the reason why it's going down, because again, diminishing marginal product, right? So as the company hire more and more workers, the additional value goes down, but the wage is constant, right? So between this wage and then this VMPL, this intersection here will decide how many workers the company should hire, or how many number of laborers. Now, does this graph looks a little familiar to you? It does, right? Doesn't look like a supply-demand graph. In a sense, it is. In a sense, this is the supply-demand graph for the labor market. Okay, so so for competitive firms, they're gonna hire people as long as the VMPL is more than the wage, and they're gonna stop hiring people. So you're gonna hire up to a point where the VMPL is equal to the wage. Let me write down another equation that you saw before many times. Is this equation, the MR equals to MC, marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, right? So for the last 4 or 5 chapters, that's all you've been talking about, marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Same thing over here, the VMPL, that is your marginal revenue. The wage is the marginal cost. So same concept. Okay, so company will hire people until the VMPL is the wage, and that's where the profit is maximized. Now, so what we mentioned before, that little graph we saw looks like a supply-demand graph. Well, exactly, because the value for marginal product, the curve, the line for value for marginal product is actually the demand for labor group. the demand for labor curve. So this line going down, that is our demand for labor. That's a demand curve. Okay. Supply curve, I'll show you what it looks like later, but that's a demand curve. All right, so the labor demand curve reflect the value of marginal product labor. So they're the same thing. Okay. All right, so there are a couple factors that can shift this labor demand curve. So first, whenever there's a change in the output price, so imagine whenever the price of apple changed, this would change the demand for labor for apples, for apple pickers. So imagine the apples getting more expensive, and then company make a bigger profit margin for apples. Then of course gonna hire more apple pickers to pick more apples, right? So really, the whenever the price of apple changes, this will shift our demand for labor for apple market. Now next, if you have any technology change, this can also shift our demand for labor for apple pickers. So this technology change, now we're not talking about the technology in the apple. There's no technology in the apple. We're talking about the technology that's associated with producing apple. Now this has to do with the MPL, so the marginal product labor. So if there's any technology that can increase our MPL, so let's suppose that there are tools developed out there that can increase our labor's efficiency. So let's suppose there's a higher ladder or a bigger basket. The laborers can carry those apples, so make the laborers more effective, more efficient. That will increase our MPL, so those workers can pick more apples in an hour. Then they will increase our demand for labor because they're more valuable now, right? And then vice versa. If you ever lose technology, so let's imagine we don't have basket anymore, that each worker must carry their apples by hand, then we got a problem because now those laborers become less productive, and then we're going to lower our demand for labor. So again, all this technology here. Now this technology here is not a technology that we can use to replace our laborers. These are the technology that actually we're using to assist our laborers. And then lastly are the supply of other factors. So those will be the land, the capitals. We're gonna talk about that in the end of the chapter. Okay. All right. So the supply for labor. So people do face a trade-off. Everybody faces a trade-off. In the labor market, the trade-off will be between work and leisure. So leisure, this will be how much time do you take off for yourself, your own vacation, how much do you enjoy your life, right? Now, for many of you guys here who are young, who are just about to go into a labor force, who are about to get your first real job in the market, you probably don't think about leisure that much, right? You only think about, what kind of work can you do, how many hours can you put in the job, how much money can you make. Well, those are good point. But eventually you gotta take some time off, right? So imagine that I give you a job offer. I say, hey, come work for me. That you're gonna be the manager of my chicken fried rice business, and then I will pay you. Let's say I'll pay you, I don't know, $50 per hour, right? So would you work for me, right? That sounds pretty interesting, right? So pretty enticing offer because they pay you $50 per hour, and then on average, each employee works about 2,000 hours in a year. That's a nice $100,000. So why not, right? So of course you work for me. But what if I tell you, hey, our business is doing pretty good. So instead of working for me for 2,000 hours in a year, can you do maybe $4,000 in a year? I'm not 4,000 hours in a year, right? Now that will double your salary. So that will double your salary from 100,000 to 200,000. So for many of you, the answer will be, oh yeah, of course I'll do it. That's good money. But also think about it, with all the money you're making, do you have time to enjoy the money you're making, right? So if you're working 4,000 hours, you know what? Let's do a simple calculation. Let's see if this is worth it. Okay, give me calculator, calculadora. All right, so we want to see a 4,000 hour in a year, and then divided by 50 weeks in a year. So you're going to be putting 80 hours in a week. And let's suppose you don't take any day off. So you're working 7 days a week. That's still 11.5 hours in a day, right? Imagine every day you go to work from 9 in the morning, you get off at 9 at night for 7 days a week, and then you're working for 50 weeks in a year like that, and but you get your 2 weeks off, but you don't have time to enjoy the money you have, right? So eventually you want to trade off a little bit, right? So you're gonna say, hey, can I take maybe a month off to enjoy my life, right? So to actually spend the money I make. So that's a trade-off. So trade-off between work and leisure. Okay. So the labor supply curve reflect how workers decision about labor and leisure trade-off. So this again respond to the change in the opportunity cost of leisure. Now, the opportunity cost of leisure is actually working, right? So for all the time we have, you are either working or you're taking time off from work, so leisure, right? So the opportunity cost of leisure, the more leisure you have, the less work you have. All right, so there are also some shift in supply curve. Um, so whenever there is a change in taste, so changing attitude toward work, let's suppose that everybody in the country all become Japanese, right? We all know how much Japanese people love their works, right? So imagine everybody all become Japanese. We all love our work, and then they will change our taste to our work, right? Also, if there's any change in alternative opportunities, so imagine that instead of being an apple picker, you can also be a banana picker, right? So those will be other opportunities. And then lastly, migration or immigration. So immigration, this will be workers from other country that coming into the country to work in the industries. In America, this is called the H-1B visa. H-1B is when we have those foreign workers come to America to work. Okay, that's immigration. All right. So the wage in a competitive market is determined by the supply demand for labor. So if you look at your supply demand for labor, demand again, this is the VMPL. Supply is the household, and then this equilibrium is our wage for the market. And then, by the way, when you guys go into upper level economic class, the supply for labor is not always a straight line up. The supply for labor, it looks more like this. So it's a line that's at the beginning it's going up, but then it concave back. And the idea is that when the wage goes up above a certain level, then many of the workers actually want to work less, right? So take some time off to enjoy the money they have. So that's why as the wage goes up after a certain point, then we see the level of employment goes down. Because people will take time off to enjoy the money they have. Okay, but for now, we're just going to assume the supply for the labor market is a straight line, linear, upper sloping line. Okay, that's our supply for market. Supply for labor. All right. Talk about this. Okay, so there might be some changes in whenever there's a change in supply for labor. So this behave just like your regular supply demand graph. So when there's an increase in supply, so if we shift our supply curve to the right, so more supply for labor, then you're gonna have a lower wage. So economic wage goes down, but you have a higher quantity of workers, right? So that's an increasing of supply. So it looks just like this. Now let's talk about immigration briefly because this is a very controversial topic. So many people have very strong opinions either for or against immigration. So immigration would definitely have an impact in the labor market because whenever we have more immigration, we're actually importing workers into our economy. So but what the net impact is on the overall economy, it depends on different market. So let's suppose that our country, we decide to import physicians, so import doctors from other countries. Well, once that happens, when there are more doctors coming into America, that will lower the wage of doctors in America because there's an increasing supply for doctors. Now, of course, there's a good news for patients because now we can pay lower medical bill. But at the same time, when we have more doctors in America, this is increasing job opportunity in other category too because there are more doctors working, that they're spending more money, then many of the supporting market can be doing very well. So imagine that there are more doctors moving into, let's say, Houston, and then we need to have more housing. Then we're gonna build more houses, right? We're gonna have more constructions, and then those doctors maybe they have a family, then they need childcare, so kind of more childcare service providing for the doctors. So all those other supporting industries will be doing better when there are more doctors coming into this area. So you got to look at different market differently. So it doesn't mean that by having more immigrants is bad for the country. And then for most situations, immigration actually is a net positive for the overall economy. So okay, really, yeah, don't pay too much attention to the rhetoric of the politics. Immigration for many countries is good. It's providing a net positive for the economy. All right, and then most economy will agree with that too. Okay. All right, so whenever there's a change in demand, that will also change the wage and quantity. So just like your regular supply demand graph, so demand goes higher. So let's say where there's a higher demand for apples, then wage for apple picker goes up, and then there are also more number of apple pickers employed in the industry. All right, so lastly, let's look at our land and capital. So we look at labor so far, but for land and capital, it's very similar. So again, capital here are the physical capitals company use, so the equipments, the tools company use to produce goods and services. But as far as prices, there's a difference between the purchase price and rental price. So make sure you know the difference. Okay, so purchase price is whenever the companies are buying this asset, this capital. So let's suppose that I'm a delivery company and then I need a new truck. And if I buy the truck from the dealership, that's a purchase price. But imagine I don't need a truck for that long, I only need for a couple of days, then I will go rent a truck, right? So purchase price is when the company actually buy this factory productions, so they own it, and then rental price is when company only use it for a while. Now the reason why that's important, because if you look at wage, when we pay wage to laborers, that's called a rental price, right? If you want to think about the purchase price of labor, then you're gonna go back to the old slavery days. So in the slavery days, that's a purchase price of labor. But right now wage is a rental price of labor, right? So the rental price for land and capital, they're also determined by supply demand, just like our labor market. And then when we have a supply demand intersecting, you're gonna have the equilibrium of price and quantity for each market. So each factor's rental price will equal to the value of marginal product of that factor, right? So what it's saying is that the rental price of land depends on how much value this land can bring to you. The rental price of capitals, of tools, depends on how much value this tool can bring to you, right? So that's what it says. Same thing as the labor. So the wage equals to how much this worker can bring to the company. All right, so it looks just like a regular supply demand graph, nothing so special. So between land and labor. But if you guys notice that one minor detail, that sometimes professors like to quiz people on this, why that is, right? So notice the difference between land and labor market. The demand looks very similar, all going down, but see how the supply for land is more steep than the supply for capital. And then many professors will ask you, why that is. Why is the supply for land more steep? Well, remember what we learned in chapter 5 for elasticity? So if you have very steep supply curve, very vertical supply curve, that is called an inelastic demand or inelastic supply, right? So the supply for land is inelastic. And the reason why it's inelastic because we have only a limited number of land, right? We cannot just make land out of nothing. So those land only exist on how much we have. So a very inelastic supply for land. That's why the supply for land is a more vertical compared to the supply for capital. Because for supply for capital, if you need more capital, we make more capital. We make more 2M machines. But if you need more land, it's hard to make more land out of nothing, right? So that's why the two supply curve are different sloped. Okay. All right. So just for FYI, that may be a extra credit question on many of your tests and quizzes. All right. So the purchase price of the capital and land depends on the value of marginal product. So it depends on how valuable those capitals are, or those land are, and it also depends on the future value of those land and capitals, right? So again, imagine if you're buying, let's say you're buying a truck for delivery. Now I'm not saying that Ford is bad, but there are also other trucks more reliable. So let's suppose I'm just so don't hate me on this, right? So so let's suppose Chevy is more reliable than Ford. Then Chevy will have a higher purchase price than Ford, because the in the future value, the Chevy is better value compared to Ford, right? So that depends on the value of marginal product in the future, right? That's the purchase price. But if you're just doing rental price, it doesn't make a difference, right? So if you guys go to a car rental place, right? So let's say you go to Hertz or budget rental or whatever they call it, and then there's no difference between renting God, what are the cars they have? Because I never pay attention. A Ford Taurus compared to a Chevy Impala, right? They will be the same price because that's the same rental price. But if you buy those cars, they'll be different value, right? Because there's a longevity involved. All right. So land and capital. So the price you pay for each capital or for each factory production will equals to the value that this factory production can bring to the company. So how valuable it is, and then the value of each factory production will depends on how much or how many these factors will have available. So again, goes back to the basic supply demand. So the price of land will depends on how many land we have available. The price of capital, again, depends on how many capital we have available. So those are the fundamentals for supply demand. And then lastly, for both land and capital, they also follows this diminishing marginal product concept. The more of something you have it, the lower the marginal product, and therefore the lower the prices. All right. So lastly, the change in the supply for factory can also change our price for factory prices. So more lands available, then land become cheaper, or less capital available, then capital become more expensive. Okay, and then it also changes. So whenever there's a change in other factors, in earnings of other factors, can also change the supply of a land or capital. All right, so guys, that's it for this chapter. I will see you for the next chapter. Okay, good luck.